Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ross Wiener. I am a vice president at the Aspen Institute and executive director of its Education and Society program. And welcome to this panel discussion on forging a new bipartisan education agenda. I'm really excited for the conversation and glad you all are here. I'm just going to paint a little bit of context, then introduce our panelists and turn it over to them, and hopefully mostly stay out of their way as they have so much knowledge and wisdom to share. Governor Jeb Bush opened this EdPalooza by setting goals of building enduring coalitions for change and empowering parents and other change makers to improve education. And policy's got a big role in reaching those goals. Policy decides how much money we spend on education, how it's spent, and makes big claims on how teachers and students spend their time. And for the last 30 years, really since the publication of A Nation at Risk during the Reagan administration, a broad bipartisan consensus has propelled education policy around standards, assessment, and accountability. But for lots of reasons, some substantive, some political, and lots that are a mix, Americans now need to set a new foundation for a bipartisan education agenda. Because unfortunately, education is as polarized as any issue right now, which is to say deeply polarized. It was really distressing to see a recent study finding that politics was the overriding factor in determining whether schools reopened for in-person instruction during the COVID pandemic. Not the rates of virus, not really any other variable. It's the political polarized lens that's actually currently informing these decisions. So there's a huge opportunity, though. There is a lot of shared priorities. There's a lot of shared interest. And at a deeper level, there are shared values that public education represents. So this is a challenge for all of us and an opportunity. I would say we're also in a moment of ferment around who decides. And I hope we're going to talk some about the how in addition to the what of a bipartisan education agenda. There are important debates around federal versus state decision-making and authority. But as equity has come even more clearly into focus, there's also questions about how we center the authentic voices of students, of teachers, of families. And that also brings into play what decisions ought to be left to local decision-making. So how far should policy go and where should it defer? So again, we could not have a more deeply informed, thoughtful group of panelists to discuss these issues. So I'm totally honored to get to join these panelists. And let me introduce the folks we're going to hear from now. We're going to be speaking with Derrell Bradford, the Executive Vice President of 50 CAN and Executive Director of New York CAN. The Honorable Jamie Woodson, Senior Advisor to the Haslam III Foundation, and a former Tennessee State Senator, Speaker Pro Tem of that body, and Chairman of its Education Committee. Marty West, a PhD, the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Deputy Director of the Harvard Program on Education Policy and Governance, and the Editor-in-Chief of Education Next. And I should also say, served as a Senior Policy Advisor to the United States Senate Help Committee in Lamar Alexander's, on Lamar Alexander's team. And finally, we have Charlie Barone, PhD, Chief Policy Officer for Democrats for Education Reform. And Charlie also was a Senior Policy Advisor to Congressman George Miller during the negotiating of the No Child Left Behind Act and for years on Capitol Hill, both before and after that. So again, an incredible wealth of experience from scholarship, from advocacy, from staffing, and from elected office. And so to get each of these panelists to introduce themselves, I've asked them to reflect on a personal experience of when they were involved in a process that led to bipartisan education policymaking, and to share some reflection about what they learned or what they took away from that experience. And Jamie, given that you are the one who has actually been in the chair of elected office, I hope we can start with you.
Well, I'm really excited to join everyone today. This is a great opportunity to share about something I'm really passionate about. And while it's not the most popular conversation all the time, given the devolution of trust in our society, I think this is an important conversation. So Ross, I'll start with, I had a tremendous privilege to serve for about 13 years in the Tennessee General Assembly. And in that 13 years, plus the 10 that followed, I've had the opportunity to negotiate in a bipartisan coalition on K-12 funding formula changes, public charter legislation, higher education funding formula changes, tenure reform, accountability changes, a broad and systemic variety of issues within education and on other topics. And I think rather than pick one, I can, as I reflect on that time, there were certain conditions that existed and certainly some lessons learned. So 3 conditions that always existed in those moments. Number one is that leadership really mattered. And you would think it's the executive leadership or the legislative leadership. But when I look back on those times, yes, that was present, but it was also cross-sector leadership. So coalitions of advocates, private sector leadership, a variety of public sector appointed and elected officials just stepping up and understanding that they had a really important role to play with their own constituencies, but they also had an important role to play to get above the trees that they lived in and see the forest for the bigger picture. The second was really trust matter. It really matters. In Tennessee, I think sometimes we talk about how well we all get along and it's not all perfect. We weren't braiding each other's hair and we weren't singing Kumbaya. However, we do know each other. We know each other's families. We know each other's partners and spouses' names. We know what's going on with each other's lives, and we value that relationship. And it makes conversations that are really tough, where there are entrenched interests, it makes them easier, and it makes them more, it gives us more of an opportunity to lead in trust than lead on the issues. And I think that for us has been very important. I think third is that parties tried to create value for each other. I mean, it's generally been a collaborative negotiation across all of those, understanding what different parties' non-negotiables are, understanding what has to be true, and then figuring out a way to win. I'd say on the lessons learned side, that can flip against you. If you try to collaborate with someone who's a competitive negotiator, and it's like, or a quid pro quo negotiator, that can be really tricky. And so really understanding what the tendencies are of the parties involved has been super important. And for us, I think that being really explicit that bipartisanship or nonpartisanship, whichever way you want to look at it, and they're different, is really what we're going to hold ourselves accountable, not just each other, but ourselves in the negotiation. And I think the third thing, lesson learned, is that being bipartisan, while this may not be the sexiest conversation that will happen during EdPalooza, it is not for wimps. And to do bold things in a bipartisan style, particularly in 2020, is not for wimps. And so this is where bold leadership really matters. It's mattered in the 20 plus years I've been in it. And certainly in every instance, it took real grit and determination for leaders to actually push it across the finish line if it was really going to matter.
Terrific. Jamie, thank you so much for those reflections. And hopefully we will come back to talking about how we can create those conditions, how we can apply those lessons in the context of 2020. Derrell, let me turn to you next. As an advocate, will you share a reflection from your experience?
Well, I just want to say I'm glad hair braiding isn't a precondition for bipartisanship. So two quick stories. I think I won't belabor them. So I guess my first great like bipartisan tilt try at education reform policy change was when we were working on like private school choice for low-income kids going to chronically underperforming schools in New Jersey. And believe it or not, there was a bipartisan coalition aligned around that, and that bill got to like the 1-inch line and didn't get done. And what was important about it was that our Republicans essentially were or our conservatives were supportive because, they support school choice and are fundamentally tilted towards like markets versus monopolies, but also because, like the teachers union hadn't supported them in like 15 or 20 years. And so so of course they were going to be for us because the other guys weren't for them. The Democrats were in a more interesting position because we're basically kind of like two groups of them. There were those that served the communities that had the underperforming schools, and they just got to this place where they're like, this has to stop. We have to do something. And there were those that lived on the rims of those towns that, because of the way New Jersey funds schools, were aware of the fact that they were paying for very expensive schools that were failing lots of kids just over the border, and their property taxes were through the roof for that, right? And so those groups of people were able to come together around our solution. And like I said, it got to the 1-inch line, it didn't get over, and it wasn't my fault. So that was the first one. The second one, just kind of like a fast forward a little bit more, is really like charter facilities policy in New York. And if you might want to look back at that, there's some great articles and videos about it. But there's a moment where the legislature in New York was Democrats held the Assembly, Republicans held the Senate, and Governor Cuomo, sort of a centrist Democrat of the time, was on top of it all. And as a shrewd politician, he was sort of playing everybody off of everybody to try to get what he wanted. And historically, the governor of New York and the mayor of New York hate each other because the governor's always like, I'm the governor, right? And people think that the mayor of New York controls New York State, and the governor historically resents that. And so, as you may know, Cuomo and our current mayor, Bill de Blasio's relationship is frosty at best. And the mayor really took a shot at charter schools, and it gave the governor an opportunity to really stick it to him, and he did for the betterment of lots of kids. And we have some sort of nation-leading facilities policy on charter schools as a result of that. I highlight both of those things only to say just that these two things, that the moment matters greatly, right? So at one time it made perfect sense to get Democrats and Republicans together around a private school choice bill in the Northeast, right? That was a creature of that moment. So that's one thing. The other thing is that what often makes the bipartisan window has nothing to do with your issue. And that, I think, is very difficult for people to get. Like, the governor wants to stick it to somebody, and the Senate wants to play along and cheer, and your bill gets done. And I think that is also particularly difficult for advocates and other people to understand. Like, people don't always do things for the right thing, for the right reasons. Like, they have their own reasons. And if you can get them together for their own reasons around the thing you want to get done, then you should go and do that.
Thank you, Derrell. And right, terrific, just the contrast between these two first reflections, both the kind of enduring principles, but also just know sometimes you have to be opportunistic. So Charlie, I'm going to turn to you. As I mentioned, deep experience on Capitol Hill and through several very bipartisan legislative processes. So eager to hear your reflection as well.
Thanks for being here, everybody. So, I started out my career on the Hill in the Senate in 1993. I'll date myself. And, so from day one, I had to learn how to work in a bipartisan manner just to get anything done in the Senate. You needed to be bipartisan. And back in those days, there were 5 to 10 moderate senators who could swing either way. So it kept things interesting. And there were a lot more opportunities for bipartisanship than there are arguably in the current Senate. The two biggest bipartisan, what I would call successes that I've been involved in, were both ESEA reauthorizations. One was NCLB, where I was on the inside and was the lead negotiator for House Democrats under Congressman George Miller, who was the top Democrat on the Education Committee in the House. And then ESSA in 2005, where I was on the outside. And when Jamie was talking, I was just nodding my head because so many of the things that she ran down rang so true. One being leadership, on NCLB you had John Boehner, George W. Bush, Ted Kennedy, and George Miller, all people who have ideologies. So that's not, you can come in with an ideology, that's okay. That's not a barrier to bipartisanship, but who are interested in getting things done and realize you have to try to find common ground. They were a really good group of people to work with. Senator Judd Gregg of New Hampshire was the 4th member of Congress in that mix. He was not so much that way. He was not easy to work with, but he let the rest of us just sort of do everything else. So the leadership there and the desire to get something done is important. And then I think we saw that in ESSA too. I mean, once it became clear that Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray were going to come together at the beginning of 2015 and try to do ESSA, it was pretty clear to me, not to everybody, but to me and a bunch of other people, that they were probably going to succeed because they're both leaders and they're both pragmatists and interested in getting stuff done. And you know, just so many lessons from all of those different efforts. I think one thing that nobody's touched on before that occurred to me about both these successes is there's always an inside game and an outside game, right? And you have to learn how to play both games. So like on ESSA, John Klein, who was the chair of the House Education Committee, had to, this is what he needed to do for his caucus, get a bill through that would get all or most of the Republicans to vote for it. That was what they needed politically. You know, there's a Reagan rule. You don't bring a bill to the floor that doesn't get a majority of Republicans unless it's a conference report, right? So for the first time around, he had to bring together a conservative bill. They still lost, I don't know, Marty, they like 25 Republicans. I mean, it barely passed. But the whole time, his Democratic counterpart, Bobby Scott in the House, who was the ranking Democrat on the committee, knew that Klein needed to do that in order to be able to proceed to conference. And John Klein assured Bobby Scott that, you know, he would come much more to the middle in conference because they knew whatever they brought back to the House would have to be bipartisan. And so that's part of the inside game. And, you know, Jamie touched on this. One thing you need to have in those situations is trust. And that is sometimes in short supply. I see some people come into this business and it's wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. They'll sell somebody a bill of goods just focused on what happens tomorrow. And on the stuff I've been involved in, that's not a good recipe for long-term success. You have to be trustworthy, and that means you have to be candid. I mean, John Boehner was one of the best members of Congress of either party I ever worked with. He just was so candid. He would come in and tell you, here's where I can go, here's where I can't go, here's my problems, and it made it very easy to work with him. And then he kept his promises. You know, you made a deal and it was a deal. And I can't say that's true for all parties involved in legislation. You know, the unsuccessful effort before ESSA, where they tried to reauthorize the SEA a few years before that, you had the leader of the NEA cut a deal with the chair of the House Education Committee, George Miller, on teacher evaluations. And then in an open hearing where they're introducing the bill, the union head, Reg Weaver was his name, reneged on the bill. That's not the kind of partnership you need in order to get bipartisan legislation passed. So I think I'll leave it at that, but I think everything everybody brought up just brought back so many memories and just rang so true, both Jamie and Derrell.
Terrific. Thanks, Charlie. Well, and hopefully we're going to help people.
I just want to say, every time Charlie name checks somebody, an alert goes off.
All right, we're going to help people create some new memories towards the end of this conversation. But Marty, I want to bring you in to share your reflections, and then we'll start mixing it up in the conversation.
So I'm going to be brief because I don't have a ton to add to the insights that have already been shared, and because I had also planned to talk a bit about the Every Student Succeeds Act process in 2015. I worked on that bill in Congress in 2013-14, where, to use Derrell's metaphor, I don't think we even got off our own 20-yard line. There was not much actual progress. But like Charlie, I was on a bunch of panels in early 2015 where everyone was saying there was no chance that a deal would get done. And I said, actually, I think they will get it done. And that's because I did have so much confidence in the leadership of both Senator Lamar Alexander and Senator Patty Murray, as well as their counterparts in the House. as people who, as Charlie mentioned, do have ideologies but are willing to negotiate from them. The other thing that I think is worth highlighting from that period is that I think a lot of what drove the compromise that was reflected in ESSA was the perceived threat of what would happen if a deal didn't get done. So I think those who had been concerned about a potential watering down of federal accountability requirements started to see that the way the conversation had proceeded over a period of several years was moving further and further away from their ideal point rather than towards it. And Senator Alexander found a way to make that vivid for them by floating the idea. I don't think he did it in a sincere way, but floating the idea of eliminating the annual testing requirement that was of great concern to the civil rights community and the business community. And I think so that was a useful strategic move in terms of highlighting a common threat that was able to drive bipartisan compromise. And that compromise extended to then setting aside some less important aspects of the legislation and really focusing on the core. And so, for example, whether there would be a small early childhood education program in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and whether it would be located in the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Education, that was the type of thing that prior to 2015 was allowed by the people leading the negotiations to blow up the whole deal. And I think in this period, by focusing on sort of a common worst case scenario, people were able to say, all right, well, let's figure out a way to work out a compromise on that as well. And then something Derrell said really resonated with me: unexpected changes in the context, creating windows of opportunity. I think there, actually, Boehner's decision at the last minute to step down as Speaker of the House and Paul Ryan's elevation, Paul Ryan at that point became very strongly incentivized to show that a Republican-controlled House could produce important legislation. And so I think he had a strong incentive to set up the process in a way that it could emerge. So those are some of my reflections on that time there. But I really do think, to go back to Jamie's, I think, very first point, the leadership and the trust among the different leaders involved in the process are probably the cornerstone of any successful bipartisan policymaking.
Thank you, Marty. And it just underscores, both the challenge and the opportunity in front of us in terms of how do we rebuild or build anew that level of trust, those relationships that really can be the foundation for bipartisan agreement. And I want to kind of really now get into the conversation and sort of bifurcate it a little bit in that we are in the middle of a historic crisis and a crisis that is having profound implications on public education in particular. So I want to start by asking you all just to talk a little bit about what your advice is to federal policymakers about where might they find the most important bipartisan consensus in a new stimulus. There was a great bipartisan consensus that came together in the first rounds of stimulus, but now it's been much more challenging. It seems like policy, the political debate is heating up right now. And so curious for your advice or your just sense of what would be most important for federally policymakers to respond to the crisis right now. And I'll say then we'll move on to really, I hope, a robust conversation about what are the opportunities for state leadership. But in some ways, states are looking to the federal government for both resources and guidance right now, I think. So curious, and Marty, would be happy to start with you, given that you were the last to share reflections, and then we'll just open it up.
Yeah, so I do think additional federal aid for K-12 schools is necessary right now. I say that despite the fact that I worked for a Republican. I say that in part because of what I'm seeing as a member of the State Board of Education in Massachusetts. So I think that needs to be part of, I can't remember what phase we're in right now, of the stimulus negotiations, 4, I believe. And a couple of thoughts. I think speed is as important, well, not as important as size, but I think acting quickly is of the essence. And actually, because states right now are really struggling with the lack of certainty around their budget processes. In Massachusetts, we've been doing 1/12 budgets for an extended period of time right now. Schools are very uncertain, not about their funding in this current academic year, but the next academic year looks very uncertain. And that makes it hard for districts to engage in the type of planning that I think is essential to respond in a coherent and forceful way to the challenges of the pandemic. So I think, it's not a particularly breakthrough answer, but I think getting some more funds out to states quickly, and I would favor doing it in a relatively hands-off way. It makes sense to me.
Can I just build on that, or
Definitely, please.
build on it and go one step further? So, there was an editorial in the New York Times in like May, I think is what it was, where the editorial board said, "Send every American $2,000 right now," and with no direction about how to spend it. It was just like, send people $2,000 today. And that turned into $1,200 to families with $500 for each kid. Again, with no constraints on how it can be spent. So it's interesting to me, like this whole process during the pandemic, the highest policy lever the federal government has is to send people money. And so I completely agree with with Marty's contention that we should send states more money to deal with the pandemic. And school systems in a flexible way, but I just also think we got to send money directly to families. And I know that shouldn't be surprising to you. However, with schools closed all across the country, parents engaged in their kids' learning in ways that they never have been. And like the polling indicates this too. People are like, if you sent me $500 right now, I could solve my own internet problem. Right? If you sent me $750, I would hire a tutor with a bunch of other people, and I mean, I don't want to sort of tip my hat toward what the future could hold, but I think there's just a change in the consumption of school that has grown up out of all of this. And I think the federal government in its next stimulus package can sort of do good things with families from the bottom up with that by funding them and their actions directly.
Charlie or Jamie, either of you?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough politically, to make the kind of shifts that Derrell is talking about. But I think particularly the surge in pandemic pods and parents getting outside tutoring really represents an opportunity to try to come up with something new. I mean, there's an equity angle here that I don't think has been present in quite a while, where it's just so glaring. And more than half of districts have all remote learning right now, and in those situations a lot of students are completely checked out for all intents and purposes. But a lot of the students of parents with means are in a tutoring pod or get one-on-one tutoring of some sort. And so the only equity thing here is if the school's not open, somebody's got to get tutoring to these kids from an equity angle. So it's got to come in through something other than the district, unless the district is willing to make an exception and have some kids meet at school. But it could just as easily be done by a college or university or a community-based organization. The Haslam Foundation did a pretty cool thing this past summer, routing money and tutoring through Boys and Girls Clubs, which I thought was pretty admirable. So I think, I'm hoping we can get bipartisan on something like that. And those are the opportunities I think you need to look for. I think for Democrats, it's not, wouldn't go as far as Derrell wants, where you just send people a check and say, go out and buy internet and go out and buy tutoring. It'd have to be something in the middle where there'd be some governmental role around quality, There are political reasons for that. There are policy reasons for that. I won't go into them. But there is a moment here to do something bipartisan that would be some level of relinquishment from the current system, and something that could do a lot for equity, both in the short run and in the long term.
And I'll just add and be brief because I know we want to get to other questions. I'll declare my own bias towards state solutions for states. And so I very rarely think, what could the federal government do to help make life better here? That said, I totally agree with my fellow panelists and being quick. And Amanda Ripley's comments about leaders should have a bias toward action during these moments of crisis. And obviously, we want leaders to be safe. We want, but we're going to have to take risks. And I think moving forward with flexibility for states with very high expectations feels like a great mindset. And I would generally say there's probably never been a time in our country's history, at least modern history, where we've been so divided, and inertia will be such an easy place to be, and entrenchments will be such an important place to be. And I would just say if policymakers can't somehow break through that, don't contribute to it and try to move things forward.
Great. And so just a few ideas I just want to put a pin in. They may come back up as things that states could also lead on, of just like direct support to parents and families, but also massive build out of broadband access, and provision of tutoring, not just the infrastructure needed for that, but actually lots of proposals out there for tutoring core, and we'll tip my hat as well to Governor Haslam. It was just such a stand-up move to just throw himself and his resources into the breach this spring and summer. It's the kind of leadership, I think, Jamie, that you were just speaking to. We just need a bias towards action. So, but I also want to pivot our conversation in two things I saw. We're starting to get some things in the chat, which is great. Really want to encourage everyone to participate in the chat. And also, if you do have questions, to put them in that Q&A chat box. We will be turning to your questions later in the session. But I also want to acknowledge, right, as much as we're in crisis, we also were at an inflection point before the pandemic hit. We were transitioning to sort of really a devolution of authority from the federal government to state leadership again in some ways, and just lots of really rethinking of the fundamentals of the education policy agenda. So I want to hear you all reflect on your advice to state leaders about where can bipartisanship be forged around state education policy in this coming legislative session, or as you talked about, kind of creating the foundation that then is ready when the opportunity window that you talked about, Derrell, opens up. And Derrell, if you want to start with that one, please.
Sure. So I would like to plus 20 my colleague from the great state of Tennessee's comments about local solutions, just because we're also in a time of deep localism that exists outside of the devolution of power from DC to the states on education policy. I just think it's sort of important to recognize that, and certainly the pandemic has turned that up kind of to 11. Two quick things that aren't the things that we sort of talked about earlier. This broadband thing, right? Though I just want to be clear about this, right? I don't want anybody watching this, any policymaker to watch this and to go home and do a broadband thing and be like, I fixed it. Because I'm concerned that is the message that is getting out there. However, given the disruption of the last year and the uncertainty around the next year, right? Vaccines, everything, whatever, the hammer and the dance, all of this, right? Public education, any kind of education, includes a computer and needs broadband now. And there is there legitimately is no time like now to get broadband to every person in America, right? And I know that's a national strategy that needs state action with telecom companies and a whole bunch of other stuff, but I think that could be super important. The other thing I would just suggest is actually between states, right? So some between state action. So one of the things that I think we've just noticed is that Some states and districts have handled the pandemic much better than others have. Sometimes they are in wildly close proximity. And so for me, like, there is a boundary-less approach to answering the question of education and education issues that states could take on together. So, for example, Phoenix Unified, right? Great school district, awesome virtual program. Why can't anybody enroll anywhere, right? We know virtual offerings, though not optimal, are of very varying levels of quality across the country. Like, if school isn't a physical place, like, why am I still doing virtual at the school I would normally go to? That kind of thing. I would love to see more collaboration around that basically says, like, hey, all of our education resources and innovation and progress belong to us all. Like, maybe we can share them all more in a more democratized fashion.
Well, I'd love to just build on Derrell's thoughts in that regard. One, I do think it's really important. I know we keep talking about the devolution of trust, but just education reform in this conversation is situated in a time where every institution within our American democracy has the lowest level of trust in it, with one exception, and that's the military. And polarization and partisanship are at all-time highs. And I actually think where state leaders can lead, it just feels different at the state level. I know each state that's represented and participating in this call has their own unique look at what partisanship does or doesn't look like. But typically states, it's not so much R&D stuff. It's urban rural, it's industry type issues, it's ophthalmologists and optometrists, it's defense attorneys in the insurance industry. It's typically a sort of view on things that's not necessarily always a partisan lens. And I think there's an opportunity with the pandemic to really take this and imagine, how could we actually start eating this big elephant of building trust and actually doing good things for kids. And so I think for me, building trust is always the first step. And how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so for me, imagine if Republicans and Democrats in a state got together and said, you know what, we just want to understand the implications of this pandemic. We're going to get together and learn together. What if they said, we want to know where our kids are? We want to not only know where our kids are, but we want to help them catch up. Simple questions like that are profound once you begin using data to inform those questions. I think to Derrell's point on, obviously, I think broadband and access, this is so real in urban communities. I'm sitting in a very rural community, and it is a product of a lot of effort to be able to be on this call with you all. I can only imagine what children and teachers are experiencing in my neighborhood right now, which isn't really a neighborhood. It's a very rural community. But I think in terms of quick wins, as you take it one bite at a time, imagine policies that could expand personalized advising, coaching, and mentoring for students. Ross mentioned that. Imagining credentials of value, which everything's been accelerated with the pandemic. What if every high school student actually left high school with a credential of value? How do you get really concrete about that? Imagine something crazy like removing a big barrier in the college access and transfer process of a common college application. Some states have that, most don't, or if they do, it's not high functioning. To me, the bigger hits are to bridging the digital divide. I feel like this is not just an education issue, it's an economic imperative, and it's a national security risk. It's crazy to me that we don't have more connectivity than we do. And second, I wonder if Republicans and Democrats could get together and say, you know what, we've got a crisis in literacy in our state, and we're going to treat it like a crisis. And we're going to do the hard stuff of figuring out how to make sure there's quality instruction, quality curriculum across the board, but particularly in making sure kids can read. It just feels like there's a lot of opportunity there that those things don't necessarily come down to hard R&D.
Well, and Charlie, you may, well, Marty, let me get you in, but I want to respond to something Jamie shared too.
All right. So, well, no, I just love hearing Jamie and Derrell talk about their different visions for what could happen at the state level. And I just think we need to keep in mind as we think about issues of bipartisan education policy making, what a mixed blessing federal involvement can be politically. So, it's very tempting. You can take your idea 50 places at once, but oftentimes your idea comes to be associated with whatever administration is charged with carrying it out. And immediately you have 40% opposition in the public as a whole, maybe much higher than that in your state. And that's what we saw play out with Common Core, which started with impeccable bipartisan origins. We saw the same thing before that happen on the other side of the partisan debate with No Child Left Behind, as it came to be associated with the Bush administration. And so I just wanted to bring that out.
Yeah, it's tough. I was thinking though, that like Tennessee's a good example. They've done some good things on their own, but a lot of things in Tennessee have pivoted off the federal stuff. Like I remember it was 10, 15 years ago when Tennessee realized it had the lowest state standards of any state. And the way that they came to that conclusion is they compared the results on their own state tests against the NAEP. And they saw how far they were from the NAEP on their own state test. And I think it was the Chamber of Commerce there that started blowing the whistle on that. And then, Tennessee is the model race to the top state. You guys, I don't want to focus on Tennessee, but it's a good example in so many ways. But you had Governor Bradford call a special legislative session to pass legislation to be eligible for the race to the top. And not only that, but before they finalized it, there were 5 people running for governor, and he had all 5 of the people running for governor sign on to the state's race to the top plan from both parties, and then pledge to carry it through, which in many ways Bill Haslam did. And then you guys had the results to show for it in subsequent years. So sometimes both things like that, where you leverage something federal or something even sometimes it's just perceived to be federal, like lifting charter school caps was really not a major weighting of race to the top applications, but people thought it was. So every state with cap lifted it. You can get change. Look, I'm a big believer that every state has a different context, and that you got to go into the state you're in, and this is true for the federal terrain too, and do some good reconnaissance about what the political dynamics are, the policy dynamics are, who the players are, and try to figure out the best path forward for kids that you can achieve within that legislative context. I mean, No Child Left Behind was just a perfect policy to put in place after the standards and assessment movement started, and the desegregation that Bush did in Texas and the closing of achievement gaps was just a perfect pathway to get buy-in from civil rights groups. And yeah, there was a lot of blowback on that, but it did some good. And I think that was a pretty good reading of how to bring things together for the positive, by W, by Boehner, by Kennedy, by Miller. And I think you got to do that in each and every state you're in. If you don't do the reconnaissance and you're just coming to people and saying, hey, do you want to do this or that? I don't know how helpful it is unless you sort of do some serious reconnaissance around the unique political and policy landscape of that particular state or that particular district.
Can I just add this one thing to that, and then I will shut up, I promise. So like Charlie and Jamie keep hitting on this really important thing about the difference between states and the federal government. Like if you're a creature of the Beltway chatterati, right? Or you troll the opinion pages of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera. You probably have a life that would let you hate the person that you would have to work with to do to build a common sense solution, and not have your life very much affected by it. In the real world, like people are like working across assembly lines from people that they disagree with violently on stuff, but they still got to go to work together, right? And in state legislatures, right, like the heat around generating solutions is just way hotter than it is when you are off, in the sort of like glacial barons of DC, or where you just yell at your enemies and whatever. So I just
it's not like that really all the time when things get done. I mean, when you want to get something done like NCLB or ESSA, the members meet, they decide what they want to do, and then they stick the staff in the room. And they're like, get to work, come up with an agreement, and let us know when you're done. And you work and you circle back to them every once in a while. And then at the end of that process, you're pretty close with the people you negotiated with, no matter which party they're from or ideology. It creates bonds that last for a lifetime. So there is all that freezing out and glacial and nasty stuff that happens. But I would go back and ask the people involved in ESSA, from Alexander's staff and from Patty Murray's staff and Bobby Scott's staff and John Klein's staff. And I think you'll find they locked themselves in a room, or they were locked in a room by their bosses, and they were tasked with getting something done on a bipartisan basis, and they did it, and they came out of it sort of bonded. And they did have an assembly line mentality when they did that. So that's not daily practice right now. I fully understand that. But when the place works, that's the way it works.
Well, and just connecting some of these comments, I mean, one of the things I'm reflecting on is how challenging it is to build that trust right now under these conditions. If you're meeting people over Zoom, it's harder to develop the depth of relationships. But also, Derrell, you talked about how we're in this sort of hyper-local time. And it was making me think, Marty, about, you're saying sort of be careful what you wish for in terms of federal leadership, because it can get politicized. And I feel like that can play out in states as well, where when the mandate comes from the state, all of a sudden things that might have support, if they kind of grew organically, become a sort of politicized issue. I'm curious what your advice is to state policymakers on kind of the process of trying to come together. I mean, Jamie, you talked about really trying to create just a learning context. Let's really try and understand what's gone on. Just curious for anybody else to sort of reflect on what's your advice in some ways for the how of state policymakers in particular heading into this next session and heading into a time where over the next few years, I feel like there are very significant questions are going to be called about just the framework for education policy in the states. Balancing the push for sort of whole child or more integrated, more holistic approaches with the sort of what's become the kind of traditional test and accountability approach. Like, how would you suggest, what's your advice to state policymakers about how to navigate their responsibilities in this upcoming session and these upcoming years?
I want to hear Jamie answer that question. She's the state legislator among us.
Well, I always want to be conscious about giving advice to folks who are putting their names on the ballot. It's really important work, and so just know that it's just words and thoughts, and I hope that it's taken as encouragement. To me, it start with the first bite. If you're gonna start this thing and you're gonna rewrite the ship of where institutions and institutional trust is in our country, you got to start doing something. And to me, even before you have the first bite, you're building relationship. You're actually not just leaving to the news coverage or the blogs relationship with your peers. You're actually knowing them. You're understanding what's going on in their lives. And I think this is a particularly important time where it would be a great connection opportunity to do. I think finding someone to work with or someones to work with and something to work on and take the first bite. I would, Amanda Ripley mentioned this, like taking this business of building trust seriously. And so I know I'm on trust a lot, but I think all of this actually hinges on, it's just so much easier to get work done if you trust each other. And it's so very hard if you don't. But she mentioned this sort of like serious charge of like build a trust commission, get people back to the table. If you can't do that, just start building personal relationships. A lot of the finance laws keep you from being in relationship. COVID has, exacerbated that because we literally can't be together. But I think that is certainly something to do. To me, de-escalating and depoliticizing issues, it's just very easy to throw a bomb. It's so easy to do the one-liner. The press does not want us to build a clock. They want us to tell them what time it is. And it's just really hard to do that. productively if you're trying to honor building trust and bipartisanship. And so for me, it's try to de-escalate and don't miss the opportunity for systems change. I think one thing that is very helpful, I wish I'd done more of it when I was actively in the legislature, is really being serious about developing leadership skills in crisis management and in negotiation. Like understanding, like, can I collaborate with this person? Is this what style is coming to me? And how do I move the ball forward? How do I take advantage of opportunities that come that I didn't see happening? How do I really get clear on what the non-negotiables are? How do I honor my own non-negotiables and make sure that what I need out of this arrangement is true for my people or my constituents? And I think for me, at the end of the day, just knowing who we are and operating as with a mindset that we care about not just an issue, but actually building trust, building relationship, and advancing democracy. But we can do it, again, one bite at a time. So those are a few thoughts. And we've got lots of subject areas like digital divide, like counselors, other things that can be data transparency, actually being transparent. Like we can come together on that. And you can't figure out how to help kids if you don't have the information to know where they are. There's just a ton of fertile ground, and I would say take advantage of it and don't let the crisis stymie you into inaction.
Well, and I'm going to use that as a bridge to go to one of the questions that came in the Q&A. But first, I'll just underscore one context that you mentioned previously, Jamie, as potentially a fruitful context for that kind of learning and collaboration around early literacy. President Bush, actually, in his remarks earlier in EdPalooza, talked about that as potentially, we maybe have proliferated too many goals, too many priorities, and that really ought to be, in some ways, the most foundational, early literacy. And I will say it is one that can get actually very polarized and political very quickly. So thinking about how to have a real learning agenda for state policymakers around what's entailed in early learning, in reading to learning to read, and what the system needs to get there is potentially one of those contexts. But I want to share this question, and it actually invites all of us to build some trust and show some vulnerability. It said, it seems like all of us are quick to interpret the pandemic as confirming our priors, but we can't all be right about everything. Do you have any new understandings or better, or have you abandoned any old assumptions that might help create new openings for a bipartisan agenda? So what's been your learning through this experience and learning that has changed something that you thought you knew or you believed before?
So I'm not sure that I have a complete reversal, but certainly I have a heightened awareness of the many roles that schools play in communities beyond their academic role. I think, we had all been increasingly cognizant of schools' role in social emotional development, but I think this pandemic heightened that, but also reminded us of the custodial role that schools play, and in many places as a service provider on things like nutrition. And I think it's made me realize that as a education policymaker, as a sometime reformer, that we need to be cognizant of those roles if we want to avoid unintended consequences. I don't know exactly what that looks like in all cases, but I think that's certainly been something that I have become more aware of over the course of the pandemic.
Yeah, similar for me, and some of it for personal reasons. My wife and I have two 7.5-year-olds. They're in second grade, boy and girl, and just having a more hands-on role in their education has given me an appreciation for all the different facets of child development that teachers have to address. Sometimes when I hear people talk about whole child, I have to sort of try to unpack it, because there are people I really respect who I think know child development well and are talking about things that really matter when they say that. And then there are others who I think, whether they know it or not, are primarily using it as a diversionary tactic and a way of making everything warm and fuzzy so that you can avoid some of the hard truths about education in some of our schools. And, I do wish my kids are in a really good school system, but I still wish they were more focused on how they're doing in math and reading and giving me good information back about how they're progressing. But overall, they're just doing an amazing job in this pandemic. We've been through all remote and hybrid, and I'm very appreciative of all the things they need to put together to give our kids a well-rounded education and the ways they help them grow and think. And it's been a real 8 months of learning in a deep way that I had not learned through, 30 years of being in this business, I have to say.
So all of my biases have been confirmed. So I don't know what this person in the chat is talking about. No, I mean, I guess so one thing was unexpected, and one thing that I knew and suspected, but I actually think is presents a wonderful opportunity for improvement and change. The first one is that, like, as much as I might stick it to some of our professional associations that represent teachers and their role in all of this, there is like a tremendous hunger among educators for another way to meet children and help build out relationships around their learning that our traditional K-12 paradigm has not given them. And I think you've seen this emerge in some of the conversations around like tutoring and pods and whatever, but like there's a new pipeline for how educators want to teach and how they want to partner with families and kids that has emerged. And I think that's wonderful, actually. So that's the one thing. The second thing I would just say is that bigger, more diverse political constituencies, this is totally confirmation bias, are better constituencies. And the reason why I say that is because the pandemic and its effect on schools have visited like the dysfunction of school bureaucracies on millions of people that normally would not have that dysfunction visited upon them, right? Because they're like, I bought the right house, I moved to the right town or whatever. And so at this moment, I think there is a coalition of parents, kids, families that is diverse by race, ethnicity, location, income level, and political party that is like, we ain't trying to do this again. How do we get something? How do we not return to what we had before? How do we return to something that is different, better, more personal, that affirms their values and fills in the gaps that Marty was talking about? And I wouldn't have thought that was going to happen at the start of all of this, but I do believe it can happen now.
Russ, I know we're getting tight on time, and I would just say that while I've always appreciated choice, and I know the word choice means a lot of different things to different people, but there's a whole toolkit there's no one silver bullet for fixing these things. I've always believed that choice is one important part of that. But I think I have a greater sense of urgency and a heavier heart for so many children and families who have no options. They don't have any ability to learn, much less get the important supports that they need to come to the learning process successfully. And so whatever choice means to us, whether that's public choice, public-private choice, whatever it means, it breaks my heart to watch so many children have zero options for learning. Zero right now. And that's created a heaviness and a sense of urgency in my work as I look at what we're all experiencing.
Well, that resonates very much. It's funny. I guess, there was going to be one more question. I was going to ask you each to look in your crystal ball about what's going to happen with ESSA, and can we recreate the bipartisan, the consensus that has really powered federal education policy, and every one of those reauthorizations have been overwhelmingly bipartisan. We're going to have to keep that for the next session. I have a feeling at the next EdPalooza, what's likely still to be a live issue we can talk about, not likely to be an ESSA reauthorization this coming year, but it's amazing to realize it's on the horizon. I want to close this out just by just acknowledging the richness of this conversation. And I think it did talk both some about what we need to be thinking about. Jamie, you ended us with options, but broadband and how that needs to be an enabler of options. Marty, really appreciated your reflection on just acknowledging the broader role that school plays in communities and in the lives of so many children and families. And otherwise, just talking about tutoring and so many opportunities, but also talking about the trust that we need to rebuild and the process we have to go through. So just deeply appreciate the leadership that each of you shows in your work and the contributions you made to this conversation. So thank you all for such an engaging conversation. And thank you all out there in EdPalooza land for participating. And have a great rest of your day.